back and forth and back and forth to the point that sometimes I don't even really think about what's being said. It just kind of like just flows through me. But then he said, there was a farmer who lived next to an avocado, and I just stopped. So I had a choice to make. Do I just go ahead and go through with it, or do I ask what's going on? And the bless his heart, the guy that was doing the preaching, said in English to me, "Lawyer." Oh yeah, because in French, lawyer is the same word as avocado. But in the moment, all my brain could come up with was a man lived next to an avocado. So fortunately, I was able to get going. And there's another story in there. Some people will tell you if you were there where I interpreted the sound of a goat, which was another thing that we can go into. So, I'm proud of the fact that I have a pretty good vocabulary because I've always liked to read. And in my job, it's just like the perfect job for me. I like to read. I like to wrestle with language. I like to interpret things. And so when I come to passages in some of the texts that I receive, if it's in French or Spanish or Portuguese or one of the languages I can deal with, I will often go through the translation to make sure that I'm satisfied that the translator didn't put any avocados in there, you know? And so I came across one where the person had translated from French into English, which was a bit odd because usually it's the other way around. And in English, the translator had written the word benignity. Benignity. And I'm thinking, man, that's like, I don't know, that's our word, is it? So I looked over onto the French to see what was there, and there in French was benignité. I'm like, he just took the French and just put it in English. Benignité becomes benignity. So I was like frustrated for two reasons. First of all, the translator didn't translate the word properly, and second of all, I didn't know what the word meant in French. So I had an idea, so I went and looked it up. And I looked it up and I found out that, you guessed it, it is an English word. Benignity means the act of kindness, or an act of kindness or mercy. Did you know that? Because I sure didn't, right? So I thought, well, even if we kept this quote English word in the document, no one's really going to understand it. And then I started feeling like a little bit like self-doubt, like, well, maybe I'm the only one in the world who doesn't understand this word or whatever. So anyway, I marked it and we changed it to something else. But understanding words is one thing. But then we have the challenge of really understanding what is being said. And I have this a lot. Like I said, in my work, I deal with this a lot. And American writers especially, we love to put in flowery language or poetic language or metaphors or images, and they don't really always work, even in other English-speaking countries of the world. And so I've learned to spot some of the idioms. And one time we had a translation that come through where the dialogue was going back and forth, and the person had highlighted a section and said, "What does this mean?" Because the little dialogue between the dad and the son was going along, and the son said, "Well, I better hit the sack." And if you think about it, we know what better means, and we know what hit means, and we know what sack means, but I better hit the sack doesn't really make a lot of sense when you think about it. I'm sure there's a reason historically for that, and when Jesus comes along in his teaching style, he loves this kind of intricate language where it's not just plain directions, like, making a cake. Get a cup of flour, for me, get 2 cups of sugar, but, a cup of flour, a cup of sugar, and then egg. And so, it's not just straightforward, even when people ask him a straightforward question. He loves to put images on top of metaphors, on top of similes, and kind of mix it all together, and then that's what he teaches. You think of it like we're used to it because we've had 2,000 years of Christian tradition and history to help us understand some of these words. But Jesus would say things like, the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer. And I'm sure that people back then heard, there once was a man who lived next to an avocado. How is the kingdom of heaven like a farmer? The kingdom of heaven is glorious and rivers of something and gold streets and trees. But Jesus comes along and says, the kingdom of heaven is like a seed that falls to the ground, or it's like worse than anything else. The kingdom of heaven is like a child. The thing you're supposed to ignore until they get bigger, right? Sorry about that, kids. I didn't really mean that. I was being facetious, which is a big word that we'll probably have to look up. And anyway, when I was a young believer, I try to sometimes, when I read passages like I did for this one, I try to remember what it sounded like when I first heard it, because I kind of sort of grew up in a Christian culture and didn't really go to church, so I didn't grow up in the church culture, but I knew a lot of the language. But when I was reading the Bible for the first time, I was like, oh man, that's pretty cool. And there was the one that kicked me really hard was, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. And I'm like, what? Like, how does anybody have any eyes left? Because wouldn't we all be sightless and lame and everything if we did that? I think that there's phrases like when Jesus said, remember, the Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for the Sabbath. Which sounds cool, but when you go back and look at how the Sabbath was made, God made the Sabbath by doing nothing. He stopped working and created the Sabbath. And so there's something going on deeper than just the surface of the words, because in the words themselves, we have the start of meaning, but then we have to kind of push through and try to find what it means. So today, if you can go back and put the sermon back on the text back on the screen, our passage from Luke says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house get broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." The word of the Lord. The word of the Lord is sometimes easy to understand, but hard to comprehend. I don't think there were any words in that passage that we didn't know. I mean, maybe a few things like purse. That's kind of still new for me. But, I know women have a purse, but I don't have a purse. But anyway, that's beside the point. The reality is that the words themselves are clear, but when we read it, it suddenly feels a bit odd. So I want to go back to the first part. The first thing we hear him say in this passage that the lectionary gives us this week is, "Do not be afraid." Right? Now, Luke loves that phrase. When the angel shows up. "Do not be afraid, Mary." Why would I be afraid? A shining man just showed up in my room, and woke me up. Do not be afraid. So Jesus says, do not be afraid. And we're going to come back to that part of it. But then it goes on, it says, it pleased the Father to give you the kingdom. So now, give to the poor. But, I think about that. It's like, well, you gave me the kingdom. Okay, please the Father to give you the kingdom. Now sell your possessions. Now sell all of those things that you have and give to the poor. And doesn't that mean that the poor, like the angels appearing, right? Doesn't that mean like the poor are now wealthy? So you've just cursed them with wealth because now you're poor and they have the money, right? So do I need to sell my stuff and give it to other people because you just said you gave me the kingdom? And then the next words are, make an indestructible magical purse. that will never rip open or lose your money. Make a purse to hold all this money that you no longer have, right? Because you gave it all away. And but you don't own anything. And so obviously, even the words of the text say, the kingdom of heaven is where you should be storing this wealth. So obviously it's not, Caesar's coins or brass or gold. You gave me the kingdom. You're supposed to sell it all, give it to the poor, make them the rich people so that you're now poor, and then make a purse. But then he goes on and he switches again to this other image of keep your lamps burning, the lamps that you don't have because you sold everything. They're filled with oil that you can't afford to buy because you gave everything away. But keep those lamps burning because you don't know when the master will return. Oh, so now I don't even own myself. I'm a slave. Someone else owns me. And I'm supposed to be a good slave, I guess, and just wait for the master to return. So do you get the picture I'm dealing with? Is we hear the words so often, but I think we hear them and become so familiar with them that we immediately spiritualize them, and we kind of just absorb them maybe and then just go on. But I think that Jesus is trying to jar the hearer's thinking a bit. He's trying to put words in such a way that make it difficult for you to ignore. So when I look at the whole first part of this thing where it starts with be not afraid, well, Jesus has, before this passage, has spent quite a bit of time telling his little group of friends, his small little flock, some scary things. Like, don't be afraid when you're martyred and killed and die for your faith. Don't be afraid when you're shamed in front of other people or punished or thrown in prison. Don't be afraid if you go hungry or become homeless. And I'm sorry, but all of those things make me afraid. I do fear like being hurt and killed. I do fear shame and punishment. And I do fear prison and homelessness. And so then when we hear these words, do not be afraid, I think it's easy for me to internalize that fear when what for the disciples, for those apostles, it was a very real fear. But I'm living in a country where I don't really fear being put to death because of my beliefs. And I don't really fear of being shamed and persecuted to the point that I would become homeless for my beliefs or my following Jesus. Now, obviously, but there are things that make me uncomfortable. But this is do not be afraid. Do not fear. And I want to know how I can do that. Because with the disciples, they were fearing for their actual lives, and I'm not really feeling. They were fearing actual shame and punishment in prison, and I'm not really going to be going to prison, I don't think. And they're fearing like homelessness and hunger, and I don't think you can tell that's not going to be a problem for me. But when I do read this, I think that the words were written evidently to ease fear and to create within the disciples the sense of you can do this. It will be tough, but you can do this. And when I read on down in this passage, it actually makes me kind of sometimes have more fear and anxiety because it says be like the slave who's ready. Like he keeps his lamp burning. As soon as the master knocks, he's going to be ready. And I'm like, well, I'm ready, but am I ready enough? Like, what if I'm not ready enough? What if I fall asleep at that one particular moment? What if I, slip and fall that one time? And it talks about these things, and so in some ways, it says to not be afraid, and I internalize that, and so I'm thinking, okay, so I know that later on, one of the disciples even asks, Jesus, are you telling about us or other people? And then Jesus, once again, tells another little long kind of poetic answer that basically says it's not just about you, but about those who will come. So the idea of fear and the spiritual idea of fear, I remember before I was a believer, and I came into faith when I was a young teenager, so it wasn't a long time in my life, but the fear of God was a phrase that I heard a lot. It was usually stressed like, I'm going to put the fear of God in you, boy. And then there was, that was followed by go cut a switch. If you don't know what that means, that was the preferred punishment in those days. But the fear of God was never anything other than, oh no, it's about to go down, right? And when I hear things like do not be afraid, and then, but then you hear fear God. So obviously there's something in that whole idea of the fear of God. And in this passage, I think the core of what Jesus is saying is this idea that fearing God is not what drives and motivates us. That we are motivated not out of fear, but in spite of fear. And I think that it's an interesting thing because as in my life, as I've developed my own theology of Scott, I find a continual kind of cycling back to the idea that Jesus made it clear. How much clearer could he say that when he asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? What's the greatest thing I should do? And Jesus said, love God. And then the second is almost like it, love your neighbor. And then we find out we're all supposed to love ourselves because it says, love your neighbor, do to your neighbor as you would do for yourself, right? So you have to love yourself, otherwise you're going to be doing, if you hate yourself, you're going to be hating your neighbor type thing. So and then you come to this passage, and this passage really, when you really look at it, doesn't it seem selfish? Like, don't be afraid, you've inherited the kingdom, you're going to have treasure in heaven, the master's going to come, he's going to serve you. And all of a sudden, Jesus is talking kind of in a selfish manner, and I'm not used to hearing Jesus speak like this. And so I think of the idea of loving God, loving others, and loving yourself as kind of like the ethical core of what happens. And if we can keep that in that order, we really can have a really well-balanced life. And I think what happens is when we kind of pull one lower and put it up higher. Well, I love God, but I love this a little bit more. Oh, I know I was supposed to do this and maybe accomplish this task, but I think I'm going to do this because it pays a bit more. And so when we balance our lives, the idea of loving God, loving others, and loving ourselves, we find that helps us focus our ethical lenses. And I believe that that's what's happening here in the sense of how do you overcome fear. I love the fact that it says that God chose freely or chose gladly to give the kingdom to the disciples. God was happy to give the kingdom to the disciples, like a father who gives his inheritance to his children. Not like a boss who gives a salary because he wants to, but you earned your salary, right? So the boss gives you your salary because you're due the salary, unless you're a slave. And then you're certainly not expecting the boss to take your place and do your work for you. Not that kind of master. So when I look at this, I remember my dad when I was very young, and I would talk to my dad, and he was kind of wise, but he was also kind of cranky, and he was also kind of happy, and it's just a weird little mix. But I remember one time I asked him, because he was talking about how he was a soldier growing up, and I said, well, did you get killed in the war? And he laughed. I said, why are you laughing? Because, watch television, people get killed in wars, and then they'll show up in the next episode of something else. And he said, no, son, I didn't get killed in the war. But he talked to me a lot about being brave. And to him, the idea of bravery was doing something even though you are afraid. And I kind of think that's my key takeaway, I think, to this passage is, be brave. Things are going to be hard. You're going to have doubts. Maybe some parts of the world still today where people are still physically in danger of their life and their families. We've had to cancel some conferences because it was too dangerous to have a conference in certain parts of the world. So there is the sense of be brave in the face of physical danger, but also be brave in the sense of your own doubts or maybe your own self-esteem or your own idea of what you're going to accomplish. Be brave, but really beyond that, because I think that's my dad's, what he wanted me to be. Like, be your own man. Be brave, be strong. Don't need other people. I'm a rock, I'm an island, an island never cries, and all that Simon and Garfunkel stuff. But I really believe that what Jesus is saying here is that the core of all of this is not bravery necessarily, but hope. Hope. Hold on to hope. And I want to close with a story that I heard, and I'm going to get the details wrong because I heard it a long time ago and I tried to find it, but it's about a young man who was from a very poor family, and he went one day, he finished his studies in the local area that he could, because he was the youngest kid, and the youngest kids got to go to school because the oldest kids had to work and support the family, so he goes to school, and so he's going to go into the city and get a job. And so he basically gets his little bit of money, his mom and dad kiss him, put him on the bus, and send him into the city. And he goes to a job, and he meets all the requirements, and the guy's ready to hire him, and he says, okay, you need to show up tomorrow with your bicycle, and you can start this job. And he goes, oh, and the guy says, I don't have a bicycle. And he goes, well, you're not going to be able to do this job if you don't have a bicycle, so forget it. Just go home. So the boy leaves the area really dejected because he's kind of qualified for this job, and he didn't realize he couldn't do it without having a bicycle. So he's like looking at his pocket, and he has enough money for maybe a couple days worth of food and a trip back home, a bus ticket back to his village. And so he decides, rather than doing that he would go to the market, because he was amazed at how much fruits and vegetables were available right there. He would go to the market, and he bought some fruits and vegetables, and he went over to a poor neighborhood that he had passed, and he resold individually the fruits and vegetables to people who couldn't get to the market. And he did that 2 or 3 times that day and came back and had a little bit of money. And now he had enough to actually stay the night in a hotel room. But instead, he decided to sleep next to one of the vegetable stalls and woke up the next morning, and he did it again. And after a while, he had raised enough money to buy a bicycle. And he thought about his mom and his dad back in his village. He thought about the mean old boss man who had said, you can't do this job without a bicycle. And he said to himself, I have enough money to buy a bicycle, but why would I? I can do more if I keep on doing this. And so he sent word back home to tell his older brother to come to him, and the two guys created this business, this entrepreneurial business, where they would take market to underserved areas, and they would create a mini market out of their van, basically. And he had a fleet of these vans. And so it became a very successful type of business for him, where he made a lot of money, hired a lot of people, continued to hire people, and he actually bought himself a house, and he bought a car, which is a big deal in those days, of course. He had his vans to do the work, but he bought a personal vehicle, a nice one. And he had his mom and dad come up, and they were living at the house with him, and then his mom and dad and his aunties and his uncles, and basically he had a house full of people. And one time a younger boy asked him, kind of like me asking my dad if he got killed in the war, why do you have a car when you don't have a bicycle? And the man said, well, if I'd bought a bicycle, I never would have had the car. And I think that goes to the core of what Jesus is saying, is that we can't let fear keep us from making the decisions that will help us, certainly. I want to enter the kingdom of heaven and help others. I want all of you to be in the enterprise with me and us all to go to heaven. And I would want to base that on the fact that it's the love of God that will guide my decisions in all that I do, so that I don't have to be afraid. And I live in that hope. And I think it was really appropriate today. I didn't think about it or know about it when I was preparing my sermon, but that we have our communion today, because really, in a very real physical sense, this is our hope. We find throughout the Christian history, we find that the idea of taking communion with people, taking together communion, is a way of maintaining hope, continuity of faith, and remembering in a very real way, not just like, oh, fondly remembering the day I went to the beach, but remembering what Christ has done for us. Because it says on the night that he was betrayed, Jesus looked around and found some bread, and he broke it. He blessed it, and he gave it to his disciples. And he said, hey, this ordinary bread is my body broken for you. In the same way, he took a cup, and he blessed it, he took it, and he said, this is the blood of the new covenant, my blood, given for you.